and welcome to the LLG Grapevine podcast. You're listening to Helen Bennett, LLG's Executive Director of Policy and Governance, and Dennis Hall, LLG Bulletin Editor.
Hello, everyone.
Now it is a busy time and there's lots in the news, certainly following the outcome of the by-election. I'm sure you're all paying attention, but let's take a turn to the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman and see what they're saying at the moment, Dennis.
Well, yes, the Local Government and Social Care Ombudsman has warned unlawful developments are being left permanently in place across England because of under-resourced councils that are running out of time to act. In a report entitled Losing Control, Complaints about Planning Enforcement, the Ombudsman highlighted, amongst other issues, poor communication between planning departments and legal teams, causing missed deadlines.
Yeah, that's right. So the Ombudsman has claimed that significant delay by councils is increasing, and in some cases, the statutory time limits have passed before councils should act. And they say that this is leaving communities with no legal remedy and developments that breach planning rules standing indefinitely. And the Ombudsman has reported that planning enforcement investigations have become a much greater proportion of planning work, because listeners will recall that normally that's sort of social care and housing, but last year it made up nearly half of all upheld planning and development cases. Now this is up from 26% back in 21-22.
Yes, and the report sets out learning points for councils based on common issues the Ombudsman has found. And the learning points identified include cases where enforcement action has drifted for years without resolution, inadequate processes to manage staff turnover, leading to repeated work and lost evidence, and finally, councils losing the power to protect areas of outstanding natural beauty and enforce planning conditions. Now, the Ombudsman said its report echoes findings from a Royal Town Planning Institute survey, which found 80% of planning enforcement officers said there were not enough staff to carry out the workload, 89% reported case backlogs, and 73% said their authority had struggled to recruit.
Yeah, well, planning is definitely identified as a recruitment and retention area with the LGA. And that is obviously speaking for itself in terms of the statistics. So Amadit Clark, the Ombudsman, said that if people lose faith that planning rules will be enforced, they stop raising concerns and we risk a two-tier system, she said. Those who follow the law play by the rules, whilst those who flout them face no real consequences. And going on, she said that we recognise and welcome government plans to improve the planning system and boost the nation's economy through increased development. But development without enforcement is a recipe for planning chaos. And without proper resourcing, she said, public trust in the entire system will collapse.
She added, we also appreciate the immense pressure planning teams are under, and it's encouraging to see so many welcome our findings as evidence to support investment in their services. The case studies we've highlighted, she said, show that with the right resources, teams can make significant improvements that benefit both staff and the communities that they serve. Simon Creer, Director of Communications and External Relations at the RTPI, said, enforcement officers are the backbone of the planning system. But as this report shows, years of under-resourcing and challenges in recruitment have led to staff shortages and overwhelming workloads.
Now, I just need to correct myself. I don't know why I continuously say that the Ombudsman is Amadit Clark when I know it isn't. It's Amadit Somal. So I do apologise, and maybe listeners picked up on that. Maybe you didn't. So let's go back to Simon Creer. He's at the RTPI. He showed that research from 2022 into planning enforcement resourcing raised the alarm, unfortunately, and that this report suggests that there's been little improvement, and that as a result, in some places, services are struggling or already broken. And he added, if we want to build at scale and meet the government's ambitious housing targets, and we've spoken a lot about that on the podcast, that it will need to be made sure that there are sufficient enforcement officers in place to ensure the planning system can effectively support delivery and uphold policy standards. Now, I think, Dennis, that enforcement has been a long-standing tricky area for local authorities. It's not just in the planning field, it's in things like trading standards. And
It's right across the board, isn't it?
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But let's move on to a big headliner now, and that's massive changes to the SEND system have been announced by government. This was last Monday, and the full details of those changes is comprehensively included by yourself, Dennis, in Bulletin 8. And here we're going to focus on those changes around the legal process and the SEND tribunal in particular, because there's been some huge developments there. The government has set out an increased role for mediation of disputes about special education needs, with the SEND Tribunal remaining, quote, as a genuine last resort, but no longer with the power to name the placement for the child. That's interesting. So a consultation paper, it was called SEND Reform, Putting Children and Young People First, details, as expected, plans to increase provision and support in mainstream schools and raise the criteria for a child to secure an education, health and care plan. Now, some parents, I'm sure, would argue that that criteria is fairly high and it's very hard to get one as it is, but that's where we're at, Dennis.
Indeed, and the consultation paper goes on to say that by 2035, EHCPs, the legal documents which set out the extra help children are legally entitled to, will be reserved for only the most complex special educational needs. However, there will be a new legal requirement for schools to create individual support plans for all children with SEND, which could include provisions such as speech and language therapy and small group teaching. And from 2029, children with special educational needs will meanwhile be reassessed for EHCPs as they move up to the next stage of education, such as into secondary school. Now, the consultation paper envisages improvements to complaints and mediation processes, quote, so disagreements are resolved faster and more collaboratively, reducing the need for an appeal to the SEND tribunal.
Well, it proposes, excuse me, it proposes that when a school complaint relates to SEND provision, as set out in the Code of Practice, the complaints panel must include a SEND specialist, such as special education needs coordinator, inclusion lead, or senior school leader with SEND experience, who is independent of the school and, if relevant, the trust. The government said it will encourage more families to use local authority commissioned disagreement resolution services for any disagreements that cannot be resolved using a setting or local authority complaints process, it added. So in relation to mediation, the Department for Education says it will look to strengthen local authority commission but independent mediation services for decisions about specialist provision.
And it will work with key mediation bodies to embed professional standards for mediation providers, and will also work with the Council for Disabled Children and local authorities to promote new guidance and share best practice. Now, although parents and young children will not have to take part in mediation, they will need to consider it before appealing to the tribunal about an EHCP, including prior to placement appeals, the consultation paper states. And it adds that the government expects the vast majority of disagreements to be resolved via the complaints process or by mediation.
Well, what the government is saying is that if parents still have a complaint about a local authority's decision not to carry out a needs assessment, they will be able to appeal to the tribunal for a ruling in the same way as happens now. But it said that the government added that it will set a clearer threshold for an assessment and strengthen and improve the needs assessment process so that it's clearer, simpler, and reflects the voice of parents, carers, and the child or young person. And the tribunal will also hear appeals against local authority decisions about whether a child meets the new threshold for specialist provision.
The consultation paper says parents and young people will be able to appeal to the tribunal against a decision that the child or young person has not met the threshold for one of the new nationally defined specialist provision packages, and therefore an EHCP. Similarly, parents and young children will be able to appeal against a local authority decision that a child no longer needs the support set out in a package and that an EHCP should cease.
Well, parents and young people will be also able to appeal for a decision from the tribunal if they believe that the package identified for the child or young person would not provide sufficient or suitable support and that they should have a different package. And what the consultation paper says is that in these cases, the tribunal will make a binding decision on whether the child or young person should be on one of the packages, and if so, which one, and whether the EHCP should continue or cease. And it added that parents are to be provided with improved information about settings that could provide the relevant specialist provision package and meet their child's needs. That's key, Dennis, because
It,
my understanding is there's a lack of those specialist provisions for a
yes,
place.
that is a crucial point in all of this, isn't it? Local authorities will give parents a list of settings following a national framework, and parents will be able to choose from one of these or express a preference for an alternative. Quoting the paper, if parents do not agree with the local authority's decision about the setting, they will be able to appeal to the tribunal. The tribunal will then consider whether the local authority's decision is reasonable. If they find against the local authority, they can quash the original decision and order the local authority to reconsider. However, the tribunal will not name the placement for the child. The DfE meanwhile says that information about a child or young person's special educational needs or special educational provision will be considered as part of appeals about the court specialist provision packages or placements as appropriate rather than being separate.
Yeah, the government said we want the tribunal to focus on the key questions of the child or young person's package or placement, recognising that SEN and SEP will frequently be a central part of the evidence for these appeals. And it goes on to say this is the consultation paper. For example, the local authority will need to consider the child or young person's SEN when deciding whether he or she meets the threshold for a package. So a child's SEN is likely to form part of the parent or young person's evidence when appealing about this decision to the tribunal. And similarly, information about a child or young person's SEN or SEP is expected to form part of the evidence for a placement appeal as appropriate.
Meanwhile, the government outlines its ambition to improve parental confidence that local authorities will act on tribunal judgments. The DfE says, and I quote again, "We will therefore publish an annual SEND Tribunals Outcomes Dashboard, providing anonymised information on the outcomes of SEND tribunals referenced by local authority." In addition, after each judgment, local authorities will be required to write to parents explaining the action they will take and by when. They will also need to publish regular updates that summarise any judgments against them and set out how they will remedy any wider systemic issues.
Yeah, well, independent special schools will be brought under a new regulatory regime to make sure they deliver the high quality support. This is the government saying they're set out in packages to a fair and reasonable price. Now, I do know that the cost of these types of schools is high because of the specialist support that they provide. And alongside this, local authorities will have a formal say on new or expanding independent provision. So places are created where children actually need them. Now, the consultation closes on the 18th of May. I think we'll definitely look to do something within our adults and education national lead around examining this consultation a bit more fully and take a view as to whether LLG needs to respond on behalf of the sector.
Indeed,
Now,
and there'll be more on this as the coming months go on in the bulletin, of course.
Absolutely, and it'll be interesting to see what happens when legislation hits the Lords as well, I think.
Yes, exactly. Some scope for contention yet.
I would say so, definitely.
Yeah.
Now, it seems a long time ago in the subject of talking about local government reorganisation, Dennis, that we were talking about these sort of neighbourhood engagement boards and what they might look like. And I think we have some commentary from a think tank in regards to neighbourhood boards, don't we?
Indeed, we do. Neighbourhood governance is very much front and centre of governance news at the moment. Neighbourhood boards that are inclusive, empowered, and well resourced and have 50% or more community representation should be established if local government reorganisation goes ahead. And so says a leading think tank amid concerns at the impact of unitarisation on local democracy. And that's the big question. What impact does this have on the lower tiers and with community engagement, something which the government has particular ambitions about? Now, in a report entitled Making the Most of It, Unitarisation, Hyperlocal Democratic Renewal and Community Empowerment, not a title that trips off the tongue easily, but
No.
this report from the Institute of Public Policy Research North said, in the same way that mayors will be granted the right to request powers from central government, communities themselves, in the form of hyperlocal councils and newly established neighbourhood boards, should have the right to request powers from unitary and strategic authorities.
Mm. Well, the Institute for Public Policy Research North, I think let's shorten that to IPPR, I
Yeah.
think, they've called for the adoption of what they say is bold participatory democratic practices. And they've said for councillors, the government should legislate to enable remote digital voting. It would be good to get some remote meeting provision first. For the public, council should increasingly use approaches such as co-production, participatory budgeting, interesting, and citizens' assemblies. And I know there's certain London boroughs I know of that do citizens' assemblies as new default ways of working. And in addition, the report suggested that hyperlocal councils be reformed and expanded to ensure democracy is, quote, within walking distance. And I think that's where parishes might come in, you know.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the key point. And IPPR North noted that England already has some of the largest councils by population and the fewest councillors per resident in Europe. The government's plans to abolish district councils and create new, much larger unitary councils would increase the population per council size fourfold from the current average of 115,000 to a likely 500,000, it added. However, IPPR North said, quote, local government reorganisation need not result in a weakening of democracy at the local level.
No, that's right. They've said that while proposals to simplify governance and support mayoral devolution have been broadly welcomed, the planned abolition of remaining district councils, and let's note that this is affecting around 29% of England's
Mm.
population, has resulted in concerns about the future of local democracy, representation, and community voice. And I think that's broadly agreed
Mm.
across the sector how that's going to work in process. But they have said that unitarisation presents a rare opportunity for democratic renewal at the local level if accompanied by intentional reforms. And for me, Dennis, what that's doing is really hitting the whole subject area with a positive message that, look, with change comes the ability to totally rethink democratic participation, which we know is waning a bit.
Yes, I think the concern is that the tier of local government that's closest to communities is going to be left behind in all of this. I think this is
Mm.
what's coming out. And IPPR North, the research fellow there, Dr. Ryan Swift, said this: devolution across England represents a once-in-a-generation opportunity to renew local democracy. There are fears that merging councils into larger unitary authorities could put this at risk. And he added this: but if devolution and local government reorganisation is accompanied by a deliberate commitment to community-led participatory governance, then it can become a catalyst for genuine community empowerment and local democratic renewal. He concluded by saying there is no choice but for devolution to work. Now, there is currently a lot of interest in this, as you said earlier, about how new neighbourhood structures might develop. So I'm thinking of planning a vlog to cover this topic in the next few weeks, so watch out for that.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. Let's have a chat about that. Maybe we'll
Yeah.
invite someone on as well to have a chat
Quite
about.
possibly. I mean, you mentioned London, but I've done a little bit of research on this. The LGA and one of our partners, Brown Jacobson, have a hub which covers all of this, and we need to have a look at some of the ideas across the country for neighbourhood structures that are already in place that might be a springboard for ideas for other areas in the country.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, now, if you work in the legal sector, and the likelihood is you do because you're listening to this podcast, Mazur, the hearing, the update, this all happened last week, didn't it, Dennis? And
Indeed, it did.
yeah, and we have been keeping close eye on the Mazur appeal. Actually, it was Monday afternoon of last week. And the bulletin that went out does contain the daily reports from the Law Society Gazette, which I would urge everybody to go back and look at if you haven't, because it kind of live reported in the way it was allowed to do, I should say. So we've already, by we I mean LLG, have already made our position clear on the arguments in this case, because having carefully considered the legal and policy context, we did take the decision not to intervene, and there were plenty of interveners in the Mazur appeal as an interested party on the basis that local authorities occupy a unique and distinctive position under the Legal Services Act. And it's increasingly clear that our role in the conduct of litigation couldn't be fully or appropriately addressed through the appeal because of the way local government works. But for this piece, we are just going to look at the arguments put forward by some of the key players. So Law Society, the SRA, albeit, and I must stress that these are not our arguments, are they, Dennis? These
No.
are theirs. This is what they are saying, not ours, and we have to be very clear about that.
Indeed. Now, the Law Society has urged the Court of Appeal not to override, as it says, the will of Parliament by greenlighting unauthorised staff to conduct litigation. The solicitors' representative body made submissions to the court in Mazur, arguing that Mr. Justice Sheldon correctly interpreted the law in his ruling last September. The Law Society argue that while many chartered legal executives and other unauthorised people are highly skilled and experienced in the work that they do, the Legal Services Act does not permit them to conduct litigation, even under supervision.
Yeah, and in its skeleton argument, the Law Society states that what Silex is asking for, quote, cannot be reconciled with the policy choice made by Parliament. Now, it added that the 2007 Act gave effect to the public interest by ensuring that those carrying on reserved legal activities are fit and proper people who are qualified and regulated. Now, Chancery Lane rejected the submission that this ruling has created factual uncertainty and says the judge recognised that unauthorised individuals can assist authorised people in relation to the conduct of litigation.
Meanwhile, the SRA argues that while unauthorised staff can lawfully assist in the conduct of litigation, working under supervision is prohibited under the Act. The regulator says that Silex's interpretation allows non-authorised people to exercise professional judgment and make important decisions in litigation themselves, which would undermine the statutory policy which required authorisation in the first place.
Well, the SRA argued that it is misconceived to seek to identify a list of discrete tasks in proceedings that may or may not amount to the conduct of litigation, and added that the key question when determining who, as between a solicitor and their supervisee or assistant, is conducting litigation in any given case, is to be answered by identifying which person has assumed responsibility in substance for the conduct of the litigation and exercises professional judgment in respect of it.
And going on, the SRA say that it is that assumption of professional responsibility and exercise of professional judgment which is the hallmark of the conduct of litigation under the LSA. Now, there will be a link to the final day of the hearing in Bulletin 9, which comes out on Friday. The judgment has been reserved, Helen, and I don't think there'll be anything from the Court of Appeal before Easter, from what I'm picking up from what commentators are saying.
Well, that's interesting, Dennis. I do think the court will be mindful of the need for some sort of outcome as quickly as possible, but I think they will take some time to obviously consider carefully. But let's see. We never know, do you? You never know when you're going to get a judgment. So, but when it lands, we will definitely make sure that our listeners receive a link, and also then we will look to explore it, and then update on what it is LLG will do next as its next steps within what we perceive to be a campaign to, in all likelihood, call for legislative change for lawyers that work in local government. But we'll see what the outcome is.
Yes, we'll see. Now, only in Britain does the news appear contrary and contrasting. In a week that has seen both political and governmental tension, as well as legal and royal upheaval, we see an article about an announcement about the right to keep pets under the terms of a private tenancy. Not, of course, that this in itself is not important, and indeed, that's why it's my last item today in the podcast. The government has written to social landlords, including councils and private registered providers, to reaffirm the importance of ensuring that tenant requests to keep pets are considered fairly and, where appropriate, tenants are allowed to keep pets.
Yes, sorry, Dennis. I was just thinking about how the importance of pets in people's lives.
Yes,
Baroness Taylor, we talk about Baroness Taylor a lot. Well, we quote her a lot.
yes.
She is, of course, the Parliamentary Under Secretary for State for Housing and Local Government. She said the purpose of the letter was to fulfil a commitment given during the passage of the Renters' Rights Act 2025. Now, the 2025 Act will impose a requirement on private landlords not to unreasonably withhold consent when a tenant requests to have a pet in their home. And then if they do refuse, the tenant will be able to challenge what they consider to be unfair decisions.
Private landlords will be required to consider requests by tenants for pets on a case-by-case basis and will be able to refuse unreasonable requests and ask tenants for further information. The legislation did not impose an equivalent obligation on social housing landlords. And Baroness Taylor wrote, and I quote, "This is an issue close to my heart, and I'm aware close to the hearts of many social housing tenants. Pets play a valuable role in providing companionship, emotional support, and in contributing to improved mental and physical well-being."
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And Baroness Taylor explained that tenants in social housing do not generally experience the same barriers to keeping a pet as those in the private rented sector. So the government did not feel it was proportionate or necessary to legislate on that matter. The minister did say, though, that she recognised that it's important there is clarity, fairness and consistency across the private and social rented sectors.
Well, yes, I think that's the point. And the Baroness added, quote, "I know that many social landlords already outline their policies on pets within their tenancy agreements. Where landlords do not do this, I encourage them to do so, and also want to encourage landlords to share best practice on how requests to have pets are considered and communicated to tenants."
Well, the minister said that policy should set out a clear process for making a request for a pet and the circumstances in which a request will be refused. So, for example, setting out non-permitted animals, species listed under the Dangerous Wild Animals Act, for example, and
Yeah.
dogs prohibited under the Dangerous Dogs Act, unless exempt.
Yeah. Now, social landlords will also be expected to clearly explain to tenants the factors that will be considered as part of any request for a pet. For example, these will include whether the tenancy or superior lease allows pets, the suitability of the property itself in terms of size, layout, shared access. They'll take into account the type and size of animal, of course, and welfare considerations.
Mm, mm. And a simple route should be provided to apply with a standard timeframe for a decision, noting when timelines may extend if the superior landlord's consent is required.
Indeed. And finally, from Baroness Taylor, she wrote that where requests are refused, decisions should be confirmed in writing with an explanation for why the request hasn't been granted, and, if appropriate, signpost the tenant to the options available for review or redress. It's an interesting topic, this, and it is an important one, but I'll pause there, Helen.
Oh, no, Dennis. That's excellent. Well done. Very subtle, I should say. I'm moving on quickly because my final item today, I think, is that I talk about the fact that MPs have been told that a form of mandatory pro bono could have a transformative effect on access to justice. Now, Dr. Liz Curran, who's an associate professor at Nottingham Law School, told the Commons Justice Committee, this was last Tuesday, that there's a big missed opportunity in the UK presently by not taking the lead from other countries to compel big firms to offer free legal assistance. Now, Curran was involved in her native Australia with setting up pro bono provisions, ensuring that firms with government contracts must provide an amount of approved pro bono services. I like this idea.
Yeah, it has a lot of implications. It's particularly, when you think of public sector procurement in terms of local authorities and the things it could require. And she said the reform had brought about a shift in culture in the legal profession by mandating a form of meaningful pro bono. And she advocated applying this in the UK, where an estimated 3.8 million people have unmet legal needs. She said, quote, there are a number of large legal firms that do not do pro bono work. Curran also stressed that law centres would not function without the free help of lawyers. And she added, there's real potential in this. I know that the government has an appetite to do this, and I would encourage them. There are fantastic models around the world in America, Canada, and Australia.
Yeah. And the Justice Committee is currently looking at all aspects of access to justice issues and asked Curran about whether the current legal regulatory framework is adequate for ensuring needs are met. And the professor said that the current system of having 11 regulators in the same form was a dog's breakfast, to put it mildly. That's what she said. And going on, she added, having 11 regulators who don't communicate with each other, who don't share their data, and who seem to focus on micromanaging. And this is quite harsh. And missed opportunities, but it might be right, I don't know. And missed opportunities for early intervention to really protect consumers is part of the problem, she said.
Interesting. And she also said there was an overemphasis on the commerciality of law, which came at the cost of good practice and client interests. Now, as I said, there's some interesting novel issues raised by this. For example, should firms be required to provide pro bono services to the public, for example, when tendering for counsel legal services? And indeed, the wider question, Helen, should all lawyers be required to do at least some pro bono work? Answers, please, to the LLG forum page.
Well, on that note, that's it for another edition of the podcast. You can read more on the items discussed today and many more besides by going to bulletin number 8, available on the LLG website now. So it's goodbye from me.
And from me too. Bye bye now.